Many independent lines of evidence provide convincing proof that life has changed over more than 3.5 billion years of Earth history. But no form of evidence is more compelling than the fossil record, which is the evidence of past life preserved in rocks. It records changes in life's history over time. In this lecture, the 56th of our series, I want to tell you about the astonishing fossil record. It spans almost 4 billion years of Earth history. I want to tell you about the nature of fossils. Then I'm going to look at the changing character of life over vast spans of time. And finally, I'm going to look in more detail about the kind of gradual change that life forms show in the fossil record. Evolution, this idea that life has changed over immense spans of Earth history, is an observational fact. It's as well documented as gravity. Now, there have been a number of theories proposed regarding how life has evolved, just as there have been a number of different theories regarding how gravity works. But evolution itself is an observational fact. Let me underscore this point. When you drop something, it falls. Drop something else or throw it, it falls again. Gravity is an observational fact. You experience it every day. Now, there are different theories of how gravity works, and that's still a great matter of debate. There's wonderful scientific research being done today on how gravity works, but gravity is an observational fact. The same way, evolution, the fact that life has changed over time, is an observational fact. Countless observations have shown us that there has been change. Now, the exact process of that change, how it occurs in detail, the nature, the rate, the speed, the factors that influence the change, those are subject to debate and research. But there is an observational fact, and we're going to explore that observational fact in this lecture. Let me first review the kinds of evidence we saw in the last lecture that also lead to this conclusion that life has changed. We have comparative anatomy. You can compare the structure and the function of bones, for example, the wing of a bat, the flipper of a whale, the hand of a human, and see those structural similarities even though the functions are so very different. We also have vestigial organs. The fact that humans have an appendix, an organ which still is operational in some primates but not in us. In fact, it can cause us damage. We have a vestigial tailbone. We have vestigial muscles with which to wag that tail. These are sure signs that we have evolved, that life has changed over time. We have the shared cellular structures, the shared molecular structures that are common to all life. And of course, we have the common shared genetic code of all life forms. The genetic code, indeed, if you look in detail at various proteins, at various genes in our body, we can see the accumulated effects of change over long time periods as we compare different organisms where the same gene functions in similar ways in all those different organisms. So in this lecture, we're going to continue to review that body of evidence, the overwhelming amount of evidence that documents evolution. In the next lecture, by the way, we're going to examine some of the theories of how evolution occurs. So again, I want to make this distinction between the fact of evolution and various theories of how evolution might have occurred over geological time. The primary source of evidence for evolution are fossils. It's the fossil record, the unambiguous testimony of the rocks. Fossils are evidence of past life. They're usually preserved in layers of sedimentary rock. Most fossils are preserved as hard parts, the hard parts of animals or of plants, such as shells, bones, wood, that sort of thing. The things you'd expect that might be preserved over long periods of time. But fossils also occasionally occur in many other forms. You have tracks and trails left in mud, dinosaur footprints or trails of small invertebrate animals as they crawled across mud. You have casts or impressions that are left by the mold. The organism itself has disappeared, but the impression of the organism when it died is left. We have insects preserved in amber. We have mineralized dung. We have leaves preserved in shale. In some cases, places where you can actually unfold the layers of shale and pick up entire leaves, even as they were preserved in ancient rock. The fossil record refers to all the varied fossils that have been unearthed all over the world. The record is vast, and that record is constantly growing. It's remarkable in the clarity of the portrait it gives of how life changed over time. I want to emphasize this fact that the fossil record is constantly growing and expanding. In 1998, for example, there were 3 entirely new genera of dinosaurs discovered. Dinosaurs that had never been seen before. And one of these was especially remarkable. It was a bizarre, large species with a crocodile-like snout, a narrow snout with big, sharp teeth. This is specially designed for eating fish. This is the first known dinosaur that specialized as a fish eater. And undoubtedly, in 1999 and 2000, and year after year after year, more discoveries will be made and the fossil record will become ever more complete. That's the nature of science, that it keeps building on its past understanding. The vast majority of individual organisms, especially those without hard parts, left no trace at all in the fossil record. Their atoms, their molecules get decayed and reintroduced in the environment. They're just recycled over and over again. In fact, our bodies are rich in atoms and molecules that were once part of other organisms, perhaps organisms that lived billions of years ago. Only very rarely did an individual die and become buried quickly enough in the right chemical environment to be preserved in stone. So the fossil record is admittedly a very incomplete record of past life. The people who study fossils are paleontologists. Paleontologists engage in the meticulous process of collecting, studying, preserving fossils, documenting the layers in the horizon in which they came. And that's what paleontologists do. They go out into the field and they make meticulous notes when they collect fossils of the exact layer, of the exact strata in which the fossils occurred. The law of superposition, you may recall, says that younger fossils always occur in layers on top of older fossils. So you have a sequence of layers, you're actually looking at a sequence of time. Every effort has to be made to date these rocks. It's often impossible to use radiometric clocks, that is, the clocks based on nuclear decay, because radioactive isotopes are often not preserved in sediments right from the point when they were buried. So you have to find other ways. Sometimes you find cross-cutting igneous rocks. You'll find layers of igneous rocks that cut across a sedimentary layer. You can date the igneous rocks, and that tells you at least a minimum age for the sedimentary rocks, which must be older. Better yet, sometimes you find thin layers of volcanic ash, which are laid down in the sediments, and that gives a very reliable way of dating older sediments. Most of the dates for the early hominids that you hear about from Africa have come from exactly this way, that there are many volcanic layers of ash which can be dated, and interstratified between those are other layers of sediments that contain the human remains. Museums preserve vast collections of fossils, and for every spectacular dinosaur skeleton you see on display in a museum, there will be literally thousands, maybe millions of smaller specimens cataloged in drawers awaiting study. By far the most compelling evidence for evolution comes from the broad brush changes of life that we see during the last 4 billion years, looking at these different layers of rock. Earth's history is divided into several long time periods based on the distinctive characteristic of rocks and fossils from those periods. I want to review life's history eon by eon as revealed in the rocks. And if you look in your booklet, there is a geological time chart that's given that shows these different periods with a few of the key characteristics of those periods, which you can refer to. The earliest, the earliest period of Earth history is the Precambrian period. It includes all the rock formations older than 570 million years. That's before the appearance of animals that had hard parts. Thus, the Precambrian period spans about 85% of Earth's history, the first 4 billion years roughly. That's a huge amount of history. Now, we divide the Precambrian into other eras. From about 4.5 billion to 4 billion years ago, the earliest period, which is sometimes called the Hadean era, that was when the Great Bombardment slowly subsided. We think that the last great globally sterilizing event, the last great impact that would have wiped out the atmosphere and the oceans and killed every living thing, at least on the surface, was probably about 4 billion years ago. So that's when life may have begun to evolve in a significant way. Subsequently, there was intense volcanism that replenished the oceans. It would have replenished the atmospheres with gases. And this then was the time that we think chemical evolution probably occurred. We don't really know when life began, but we are quite sure that the oldest rocks on Earth, which date from 3.8 to 3.5 billion years old, contain signs, clear signs of single-celled organisms. You can make thin slices of these rocks. You can look at them in a microscope, and you can actually catch the microbes in the process of dividing in some cases. So we have clear evidence that cell division was going on and that microbes were around at that point. So we know that life must have arisen very soon after the end of the Great Bombardment. We then have rocks from about 2.5 billion to 1 billion years ago, and these reveal an increasing diversity of single-cell life forms and the first signs of multicellular life. We see strands of cells that are identical to modern blue-green algae, for example, and they suggest the beginnings of an oxygen-rich atmosphere, the beginning of the production of atmosphere by about 2 billion years ago. Then, about 1 billion years ago, there are a number of dramatic changes that we begin to see in the fossil record. You start seeing possible worm burrows at about this time. Also, the first fossil jellyfish and other multicellular organisms seem to appear at about 1 billion years in age. The most dramatic change in the rock record occurs for this early period at about 700 million years ago, which suggests that there was a period in Earth history where there may have been a period of very extreme cooling. In fact, so extreme that the entire oceans may have frozen over. No one is sure exactly what happened at that period 700 million years ago, but it does represent a dramatic change in Earth climate, and that's the subject of a lot more study. Well, following what may have been then a great thawing of the oceans, there was an abundance of soft-bodied, multicellular ocean life that appeared, and these are found preserved as impressions in various rock layers around the world. So while there may have been multicellular life, nevertheless, if you were transported back to that early ocean, say 600 million years ago, it would have seemed very, very alien. The surface of the Earth would be more or less barren, maybe just green scum coating some of the rock surfaces. The oceans would now have none of the abundance and variety of life that we see today. Very few recognizable sea creatures at that time. Then we come to the next great period of life called the Paleozoic era, which stretched from 570 million years ago to about 245 million years ago. This saw diversification in life and the introduction of many of the familiar groups of animals and plants that we now know. We have tens of thousands of feet of Paleozoic sediments found in the central United States alone, layer upon rock. And you were able to look at these from the lowest level of rock from nearly 570 million years ago right up through the whole Paleozoic, and you can see the succession of changing life as you go through these rock cuts. Many times when you drive across the center of the United States, you'll see these rock cuts in Kansas and in Nebraska and other Midwest states. You'll see these beautiful rock cuts, layer upon layer of rock, and they contain an abundance of life. The Paleozoic era also saw the closing of a precursor Atlantic Ocean. In plate tectonics, an early Atlantic Ocean was actually closing up at about that time, and then it stayed closed for a while, and then later on it began opening up again, and that's the modern Atlantic Ocean. We see all these continuous plate tectonic processes also bringing continents together, closing them up, and these are evidence also from fossil rocks, so you can see where fossils line up across different continents that are now separated today. 570 million years ago saw the Cambrian explosion. This is an explosion of life characterized by the first appearance of animals with calcium carbonate shells, the first appearance of hard parts in the fossil record. You saw the first ancestors of snails. You saw the first arthropods, especially the beautiful trilobites, which can occur in specimens up to 3 feet across. Many other kinds of shell organisms, brachiopods and so forth. This period extended to about 520 million years ago. The next period is called the Ordovician period, 520 to 450 million years old. And this was a time of extensive limestone reef formation, reefs with many kinds of primitive organisms, corals. The first primitive fishes occurred around that time. Those were the first vertebrates with bony skeletons. Also an abundance of shellfish called brachiopods, beautiful brachiopods preserved around the world as fossils. And when you find one brachiopod, you're likely to find hundreds of them because these were very abundant organisms. The next period is the Silurian, from about 450 to 420 million years old. It was marked by the first land plants, the first insects, and also an explosion in the variety of fishes. We then had the Devonian period, 420 to 375 million years old. This is when seed plants first developed, as did amphibians, which were the first of the land vertebrates. The Carboniferous period comes next, 375 to 285 million years. This is the first winged insects appeared, things like dragonflies, the first reptiles, diverse land plants that formed thick coal deposits. And what you usually think of in geology when you think of the Carboniferous period is all the coal deposits with beautiful plant fossils preserved as various leaves and stems. You can also find larger structures which indicate there may have been trees and other large types of plants that grew much, much taller than in previous times. And the last part of the Paleozoic was the Permian period, from 285 to 240 million years. It was marked by the appearance of the first mammal-like vertebrates and an increasing diversity of land plants and land animals. The Permian period also saw the final assembly of Pangaea, which was a supercontinent with land masses from what is now Europe, North America, Africa, and South America, all sort of joined together. Now, everywhere in the world where you find Paleozoic rocks, you find the same sequence of geological periods. You find the same sequence of distinctive fossil types. This is all over the world. Fossils of a younger period are never found mixed with those of an older period. If you were suddenly transported to the end of the Permian period, you'd find lush green jungles. You'd find diverse coral reefs. But the living world in detail would seem quite different from what you see today. Now we come to the Mesozoic era, the age of reptiles, from 240 to 65 million years ago. This began with a shocking and still unexplained extinction of more than 90% of all the species on Earth. All the trilobites disappeared. Most of the brachiopods and many other large groups of organisms just vanished completely from the fossil record. This mass extinction provided opportunities for whole new groups of plants and animals to fill the vacated ecological niches. So we have the Triassic period, that's 240 to 195 million years ago, which saw the appearance of the first true mammals, the first beetles, the first dinosaurs from this period, and these dinosaurs rapidly diversified and filled many of these ecological niches. They became dominant on land, on sea, in the air. We also had the first ammonites in this period. Ammonites were an amazing, successful group of marine organisms, absolutely exquisite and beautiful. Some of these organisms grew up to 6 feet across. They're characterized by very detailed and complex suture lines, the little squiggly lines you can see on the surface of some of these ammonites. And those suture lines, the shape of them changed and evolved very, very rapidly. So ammonites provide a wonderful way of almost million-year by million-year increments telling where you are within this Mesozoic period. It was also about this time, by the way, that the modern Atlantic Ocean began to open up, about 200 million years ago. Next, we come to the Jurassic period, 195 to 135 million years ago. That was the height of the age of dinosaurs. The era also saw the first birds. The first flowering plants then evolved during the next period, the Cretaceous period, from 135 to 65 million years ago. This is the period when the Rocky Mountains began to form in North America. It also is a period when, because of plate tectonics, large land masses were gradually accreted onto the west coast of the United States in a whole series of collisions of one land mass after another being plowed onto, new terrains being added onto North America. So North America began to get wider and wider during this period. If you visited that early Earth at the end of the Mesozoic, the world's forests and meadows and grasslands would have a familiar feel to them, though I have a feeling that the dominance of all the large lizards around you would probably seem somewhat unsettling. And then we come to our modern age, the Cenozoic period, from 65 million years ago to the present. This period began abruptly with the extinction of many of the large groups of animals, including all the ammonites and all the dinosaurs. The geological and geophysical evidence now suggests that a large asteroid hit the Earth near the modern-day position of the Yucatan Peninsula, and that this impact caused such devastation, such production of dark clouds in the atmosphere that shut off the sunlight perhaps for months at a time, that the mass extinction followed. Well, the Tertiary period then gives new opportunities for other organisms to enter these vacated ecological niches. And the mammals are the ones that took over. From 65 to 2.5 million years ago, we have the Tertiary period, which saw the great opportunistic diversification of all these mammals. The period also saw an explosion in the variety and the distribution of flowering plants, which characterize our modern world. There was lots of plate tectonic activity going on during this period, and indeed our modern globe, the distribution of the continents, was shaped during this period. Australia, believe it or not, separated off from Antarctica. India at this period collided with the Eurasian plate and began to form the Himalayan mountains, and the Atlantic Ocean continued to open up. The tertiary period has also been divided into finer and finer units because the fossil record reveals so much detail about the evolution of each of the major groups. We have so many more fossils from the modern period because we have more strata from the recent age. And of particular note are the various mollusks. We have clams, we have snails, and it turns out that these types of organisms evolve extremely rapidly. Various types of snails from the fossil record change almost in a million year by million year basis, so you can date strata extremely well looking at gastropods, or these snails-like things. Also, the clams, which occur in a whole variety of forms, some of them small and beautiful, delicately ornamented. These also change so rapidly in the fossil record that you can date individual strata all around the world on the basis of the distinctive organisms. The last 2.5 million years of Earth history is called the Quaternary period. It's the modern ice age. It's a time marked by repeated advances and retreats of glaciers. Our own genus, Homo, appeared during the beginning of the Quaternary period, and our species, Homo sapiens, apparently evolved sometime in about the last 250,000 years. All of this evolution from the Precambrian to the modern time can be illustrated on a geological timeline. And again, I refer you to the geological time chart that's shown in the booklet. The geological record, the fossil record, also reveals evolution in finer and finer scales. We can observe individual types of organisms as they change layer by layer through rock sequences. And this is another fascinating aspect of paleontology. I want to tell you about one set of these rocks, a set of trilobites that were found in Ordovician rocks near St. Petersburg, Russia. They beautifully illustrate this point of gradual change through layers of rock. These specimens that I'm going to show came from the banks of the Volsho River near St. Petersburg. And what you find in a series of trilobites from this era, about a 3 million year sequence of layered, very beautiful, fine-grained limestones, is that there's a gradual change in the appearance of the trilobites. At the very base, at the bottom of these rocks, you find a very common species of trilobite, one that's found around the world, called a Asaphus. Trilobite had small, nubby-like eyes. It typically burrowed in mud and may have scavenged in the mud for remains of dead animals. We're not really sure of its lifestyle. This is a very common kind of trilobite around the world. But in these particular rocks, as you go up this rock section, as you get younger and younger, you see a gradual change. About a third of the way up through that section, you find similar trilobites, Asaphus species, but they suddenly have eye stalks, maybe 1/4 of an inch long. These trilobites burrowed a little bit deeper into the mud, and therefore perhaps were able to escape predators more easily as they looked for food. As you go even farther up in this section, you find trilobites with longer eye stalks, and 1/2 inch or more. Same basic species, or same basic genera anyway, but longer eye stalks. And you go to the very top of this sequence, you find astonishing trilobites with eye stalks up to 1 inch long. Apparently, an evolutionary adaptation to escape predators. This is a complete sequence. At the bottom of this section, you don't find long eye stalks. At the top of the sequence, you don't find anything but long eye stalks. Clear evidence that life has changed in detail gradually over time as you go from the bottom to the top of this 3 million year sequence. The evolution of whales provides a more recent example of this gradual change process. Though they are mammals, whales have no legs. They seem so different in form and in lifestyle from other living mammals that it really seems difficult to imagine how they could evolve. And anti-evolutionists often use whales as proof that evolution has not occurred and could not occur. I want to read you a quote from the evolution, this creationist literature that goes against the idea that whales evolved. This is a quote. "Darwinists rarely mention the whale because it presents them with one of their most insoluble problems. They believe that somehow a whale must have evolved from an ordinary land-dwelling animal which took to the sea and lost its legs. A land mammal that was in the process of becoming a whale would fall between two stools. It would not be fitted for life on land or sea and would have no hope of survival. Here's another quote of a similar vein. There are simply no transitional forms in the fossil record between marine mammals and their supposed land mammal ancestors. It is quite entertaining, starting with cows, pigs, or buffaloes, to attempt to visualize what the intermediates may have looked like. Starting with a cow, one could even imagine one line of descent which prematurely became extinct due to what might be called an udder failure. Well, that's an amusing quote, but it does make a point about the fossil record. There are gaps, there are things missing. And the commentators are correct. You'd expect to have intermediate forms. So what do paleontologists do? They go out and they find those intermediate forms. Indeed, in the last decade, paleontologists have found several of these missing links between land animals and whales. Moving back in time, one such intermediate form is the 35-million-year-old Basilosaurus. It's a sleek, powerful, toothed whale, and a recent discovery of a complete fossil in Egypt included tiny vestigial hind legs, bones of a complete hind leg that belonged to this whale. Now, this is a feature without any obvious function for the whale. It's a vestigial limb that was gradually disappearing but was still present 35 million years ago. An even more primitive whale, Rhodocetus, has more exaggerated hind legs, not unlike a seal. And then finally came the discovery in 1994 of the new genus Ambulocetus, the walking whale. This beautiful creature is a true intermediate between land mammals and sea mammals. It has features of both. You see, evolution is a robust theory. It makes innumerable predictions about intermediate forms that should be present in the fossil record. And the fossil record now is not complete. Each year we discover more and more, and we fill in the gaps. Each new discovery generally fills in a slot between previous missing links, if you will. And so we get an ever more complete picture of how life has changed over immense spans of time. In summary, fossils are the evidence of past life that are preserved in rock. They provide an amazing view of almost 4 billion years of biological change. We can view that change by looking at successive layers of rock, epoch by epoch in successive layers. As new fossil species are discovered month by month, that fossil record becomes more detailed, becomes more complete, and the gradual evolution of life becomes much more firmly established. But we're left with a puzzling question. How does that change occur? By what process can you go from one species to another, or develop whole new lineages, whole new lines and genuses of animals? In the next lecture, we're going to examine the pivotal role of Charles Darwin in his epic development, the theory of evolution by natural selection.